Carlo, you recently commented that you were dwelling between the material sonic representation of inner images
Rachmaninoff.
and the images of non-representational sonic matter.
A sort of dichotomy of piano philosophy, piano touch, and approach to piano in general, Rachmaninoff and Busoni. The second quote referred to Busoni, not by Busoni, by myself, referring to Busoni and his instrumental aesthetics. To make it simpler, I must confess that both Rachmaninoff and Busoni are very influential figures for me, to me, both as pianists and as piano experts on piano writing, piano composing. In the case of Rachmaninoff, it is essential for a performer to be very faithful to what the composer demands in his score, especially in works like these preludes, Opus 32, which I find are extremely educational for would-be pianists, would-be performers, to pianists, performers, advanced students, advanced pianists, because the writing and the expressive grammar of the composer and the composer pianist is very well thought out and very generously delivered to the performer through the score expression marks. See, for instance, here, he fastidiously writes all small, minor, major accentuations on each note of this Siciliano rhythmic figuration. And even in the first, this was the beginning of the second prelude, even in the first prelude, very, very, very careful in giving accents, writing them all out. So for the performer, this is a challenge, but it also helps more than any other piece by Rachmaninoff get into the mentality of Rachmaninoff, the composer, pianist, and the pianist, composer. It is very important that a performer has images, sometimes even concrete images. There's a sort of total integration between feeling, idea, emotion, and technique. Busoni, I shouldn't say is the opposite, but a sound like this, can it be sonic matter? Can it be material representation, or just the opposite? I should say that whereas in Rachmaninoff I work at making the instrument as colorful, color with a purpose, with an aim, as colorful as possible, as metaphorical as possible. I don't, the music doesn't trigger associations necessarily with orchestral instruments, but with even imaginary instruments. In Busoni's case, in this music, in this passage, for instance, what I just played, one should not be tempted to find a concrete association, but rather something, an idea, a sound idea that does not belong to your sensual reality. So this is the dichotomy that I find in these composers, that I find, as I said before, very influential figures. For me, are models as pianists, and that yet very different one from another.
I think there's something that's worth noting in this context, namely that the entire idea of actually naming a piece of music according not to the form, or not according to some kind of musical form, like a sonata, right? But based on some sort of pictorial image.
Like the Etude tableau.
Exactly. That was a modern idea at the time, and something that composers absolutely objected to in the past. Chopin is a wonderful example. Once his first scherzo was published by an English publisher under the title Infernal Banquet, and Chopin got furious.
Yes, indeed. Chopin didn't write tone poems, even though the ballads somehow have a literary connotation or reference. But the music, in fact, it wouldn't belong to that kind of romantic aesthetics to have pictures, definite pictures behind the music, although Liszt would enjoy flying with his imagination and also perhaps capturing people's imagination with the aid of specific literary reference. Schumann did that too, but without any direct literary evidence, with some exceptions, Papillon or Kreisleriana. But Rachmaninoff's Etude tableaus, in fact, these preludes are much more etude than preludes, because they are single-minded. There is a specific instrumental composition element that is so pervasive and so that diffuses the whole composition. So basically, one can say that Rachmaninoff is, in my opinion, more of a modern composer than a romantic composer. Even though the harmonic background is hyper-romantic or late romantic, the shape, the way, the relationship between thought and time is much more modern than romantic. The time shrinks, the time is compressed, sometimes the time flow is diluted.
Is that what makes them preludes for Rachmaninoff?
I think that's what makes them preludes, not etudes, but the pianistic writing is very much, has a lot in common with that of etudes, and Chopin's etudes have been incredibly influential on composers.
Exactly, and piano composers of small forms
Especially.
after Chopin. Like there's a certain type of I think all of these Rachmaninoff preludes seem to start with some core idea, and then Rachmaninoff develops the idea, and then it blossoms, it blooms towards the middle a little bit. Like there's an expansive, some of them have a direct ABA structure, right? But he tends to take this germ, this little idea, expand it, develop it. It gets more and more complicated pianistically, often in the middle, and then it dies away again.
There is a climax. Rachmaninoff himself always claimed that his aim, also as a pianist, as a performer, was that at reaching a specific climactic point in the composition, not only his own compositions. So that climactic point, did I say climatic or climactic? The
Climactic point.
Climactic point. I didn't mean weather.
Yes.
Although the music tends to gain some heat and gets rather warm and hot.
And cold and icy. I mean, there's something, you can make that analogy.
No, this is just academia between me and you. I don't think we want this to be on the video, do we? But perhaps leave it. Yes, why not? It's fun. People will understand us.
But this is actually the heart of this very topic, like the idea of imagery in music as a relatively modern idea, not too much more than a century ago. We're starting about a century and a half ago.
He did write a fantastic work that has been also transcribed for piano, The Isle of the Dead, based on a painting. And he himself said that he needed to have strong images. Even a story, he needed to have strong images in order to compose. So we don't want music to be reduced to simple. We don't want classical music to have subtitles, do we? Or direct reference, we don't want it to be didascalic. However, there is something behind that can be more or less concrete. In the case of Rachmaninoff, compared to Busoni, is more concrete. In the case of Busoni, is absolutely just the opposite. Doesn't want to have any direct reference. This is music devoted to the cause, to the aesthetics, the spirituality of Indians, American Indians, but you don't really want to hear that sound or that other sound. You want to, somehow, you want to imagine, could we say, a frame of mind, a sonic concept, a sonic representation of no material reality. And the approach of the pianist is totally different. It's the pedaling, the touch, the accentuation, the phrasing, of course.
There are two things that come to mind, and they're two totally different topics. Number one is the idea of this point, this one central climax that Rachmaninoff would build to, both compositionally, but also in his playing, as you mentioned. And he was extremely self-critical and would very often, after a concert, say, "I missed the point."
Yes, exactly what I meant, yes.
The second is, can you detail something of your approach to these two different composers and why you're pairing them together? Because we really should talk about the history of these works. They're from the exact same era. Rachmaninoff wrote the Opus 32 Preludes in 1910, right? And Busoni was inspired. He got his inspiration for the Indian Diary in 1910 while visiting a former student. And then he composed these pieces 5 years later. And so they're from exactly the same era, yet you can't say they're polar opposites. I mean, Busoni was a very interesting composer in that some commentators say that Busoni was born too early, in 1866, is that right? Because he was a modernist in a way, and yet he was still very much a romantic composer with some modern ideas. There was some experimental works like the Sonatina Seconda, which is an atonal work, but there's very little of that in Busoni actually.
There's a problem with us pianists let's call it a problem, or should we call it an idiosyncrasy, a sort of a tendency in learning from our fingers also, not only from our ears. We should learn more via our ears, our eyes, but pianists, especially prodigy pianists like Busoni, for instance, he was a phenomenal prodigy. In the first diary of Busoni, there is a compositional element that connects the whole composition. Strangely enough, or curiously enough, it is the same element that connects Rachmaninoff's preludes, and that is the semitone. This is the accompanimental, I should put in quotes, accompanimental figure, and this is the theme, which is the inversion of this motive. So basically, things happen almost unconsciously. This figure becomes invasive. We must remember that the reoccurrence in the new A section is one semitone below. So I don't want these elements to be too present. I like to leave them at a subconscious level in Busoni. The pedaling is more hazy, it's not very definite. Certainly overlapping pedaling, or super legato pedaling that is very important, very necessary. Sometimes in Rachmaninoff, it would kill this sort of haziness, unsaid quality of Busoni's music. In Rachmaninoff's case, very important that each note is connected lyrically with a good expressive intonation, with an ever-changing modality of pedaling, finger pedaling and actual foot pedaling. This increases the variety that has to be of touch that has to be spot on. Each harmony has its own color, meaning direction. Therefore, a different voicing, a different direction. Can I do that in Busoni's music? Almost never. It's something that lies in a zone of, as I said, consciousness, or perhaps in a dreaming stage. Even when I replay the theme in A flat here, you see, I am very cautious not to give any idea of a romantic tendency in my playing, in my connecting the harmonies. Busoni's music is less eventful, and the magic of uneventfulness is an expression that relates a lot to Busoni's aesthetics.
How do you respond to the claim that's frequently made about Busoni that he was a quote-unquote intellectual composer?
Well, I agree up to a point. He had a great intellect. He wrote and spoke like an intellectual. He wrote a lot. Many people know Busoni through his writings,
such as the aesthetic, the sketch of a new aesthetic of music.
Much more than that. Of course, there are letters, there are articles. A figure like that, even more than Busoni, even more intellectual in the speculative way, is Sorabji. So when you read Sorabji's writing, you think you're very stimulated intellectually. And then if you listen to his music after reading his writing, which is, I think it's not always a great idea to know a composer's music after knowing his personality, her personality, writings, aesthetics, because Busoni's music doesn't sound intellectual to me. It sounds, in a way, it sounds, again, quotes, unintellectual. That is really beyond your intellectual reasoning. And perhaps because of this lack of immediacy, when a composer is not immediate, it's not first-hand clear, you tend to think this music is intellectual because it requires an intellectual reasoning. I think this is a stereotype that doesn't always make full sense to me.
You can call Beethoven an intellectual composer
just
because of the sheer the density of his musical architecture. For example, like the way he could take one tiny motive and compose a massive piano sonata or a symphony out of this tiny little motive, not to mention his late works that were really incredibly radical, like the last string quartets.
So you're speaking about an intellectual composer because of the exertion of his intellect in the compositional process.
Well, the question
right?
is,
So
it's often,
whereas people think you're intellectual because you think your ideas behind the music are intellectual.
there's a
This
wonderful
is the misunderstanding, isn't it?
exactly, and there's a wonderful quote by Pierre Boulez in one of his essays, in which and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact quote, but he says effectively, if people call me an intellectual musician, I can't take that as an insult, no matter how insulting it may be intended, right? But a lot of there's a misconception that musicians simply let go and we're all extremely creative, right-brained, and that's what we're doing most of the time. But that's not really how we practice most of the time, is it?
I think, of course, I can only speak from my own experience and from the indirect experience of notable, illustrious colleagues. The intellectual exertion, should we say this, in music making, being it composition or performance or listening even, is may mean many different things. As I said before, it could even mean something that is extra musical, that exerts your intellect, your imagination, your concept. Busoni himself said that music cannot possibly convey concepts that are conveyed by words, cannot possibly do that. The music can convey emotions. Now, there's a tendency in modern times in thinking that when the music is not necessarily emotional, or that music shouldn't be too emotional, but basically Busoni didn't believe that music could convey specific philosophical concepts. For instance, we should all agree on that. What happens in our mind, in our imagination when we listen to music is something that should not be described by words, even though in teaching, in pedagogy, sometimes it is necessary to pull out, to somehow trigger some sort of imagination, metaphor, thinking with words. But it's always a very dangerous thing. It's always very reductive. Working as a pianist, at learning a piece like a Rachmaninoff prelude, a challenging Rachmaninoff prelude, has to require a good deal of intellectual effort in knowing exactly what you're doing, how you're learning. The learning strategies have to be absolutely thought out. Nothing must be left to chance. You will regret it later on that you've learned the wrong way. Should we say this is the left side of the brain? The right side of the brain should connect to the left side by means of a very free and intense emotional involvement, but one that is always connected to some healthy decision making. The most desirable thing is to learn data both intellectually and emotionally. I cannot think of music that is only one of these two parameters, emotion and intellect. Even music that is born to be an emotional, even some serial music, somehow it can appeal to you emotionally and intellectually. So the work on a piece like this prelude, which is so beautiful, let's underline the word beautiful, needs a careful study of this accompanimental figure, which is typically Russian, this dwelling between two notes at the distance of a second. And it does require a careful study of tone production in the right hand. one layer, 1 second layer, first layer, second layer. And this is the third layer that begins with an upbeat. Therefore, you don't want to play too loud. So this is the, should we call it the expressive grammar stage of piano practice that should be done after a very long and intense interaction with the score before you even sit at the piano. I like to do that. I know some pianists love to do that, really interact with the score, read the score as if they were reading intellectually a very challenging piece of poetry, or leisurely as a non-challenging but very emotionally involving or even amusing, should we say, comics or narrative. It has to have all these elements combined together before you even attempt them at the keyboard. Because you really want to be emotionally engaged, but intellectually want to have everything clearly thought out before you sit and search for the right technical approach to each note. Because fingers do remember what they do, and we don't want them to remember things just because by chance they happen to be the wrong way. I think we've talked about this, Albert, many times, and I know we agree completely.
Yeah, there's also, I'm reminded of an approach that's pretty common, right? Many music students have this idea of first the notes, then the music.
Oh, the bad students, you mean?
Exactly.
Sorry to say. Yes.
Well, I think it's a great misunderstanding, because
no professional thinks that. No professional thinks that.
But I know I've encountered many music students.
They will not be professional musicians, even if they're very talented. Sometimes you can change in life. You can change your approach to music, but you'll have to, you have to pay the price. It will take its toll on you, having bad habits that derive from a bad culture, basically, because you think making music is spontaneous, is easy. It is the most difficult thing for a pianist, to make music the way we wish it to be done. It is really the single most difficult. As you mature, you realize it more and more. You convince yourself how silly you have been if you haven't developed not only the sensitivity but the ability of doing professionally, musically, artistically, what you wish to do. Because your body has its own memory, in good and for the better and for the worse.
That's right, and it's so much more difficult to correct something
Sometimes
that you've already learned.
Impossible.
It can be.
Sometimes it's too late.
So this myth, just to explain this myth of first the notes, then the music.
Doesn't
in other
make
words,
sense.
Yeah, because what you have to know really in advance of practice, the shapes, the grammar, the expressive grammar, as you put it, in advance of all the phrases, of the motives, right, and practice that and really embody that, get them into your nervous system and your muscles. And if you think you could just add the articulations later, add the
doesn't sound right.
The slurs.
I think the most difficult thing to correct is rhythm and rhythmic sensitivity, because it is materially the least apparent. It's making a rhythmic mistake. By mistake, I don't mean an obvious mistake about the duration of notes. But see, whereas wrong notes, wrong dynamics, unevennesses of touch are more noticeable, even visually noticeable. Rhythm, phrasing, rhythmic shaping of a phrase, you don't see that. You have to really hear it. And when you're engaged in playing, it's more difficult to hear what you do as if you were, as if you could travel from your body and be the elect listener of yourself, which is an ideal state. We should try to be listeners of ourselves. We should try to do that, but it's really very, very, very difficult. And rhythmic must be cultivated at a very early stage of pianistic development. It's very hard to correct rhythmic sensitivity as well as rhythmic control. Sometimes there is an impulsive urgency in playing, in being heard, that makes you ignore silences. But I think most of the time is also a technical flow, especially when what I call negative articulation. For instance, in the second Busoni diary, this sort of non-legato is a metaphorical non-legato. Could it be the hoofs of horses galloping? We don't want to have, in Busoni, we don't want to have too clear an image. But in Rachmaninoff, see, it is a sound. It's not metaphorical, it is musical diction. And this releasing as the key as well as depressing it is a very, very important feature of quality technique. But speaking of rests, there are not many rests in Rachmaninoff preludes. There are many in Busoni. After a harmony of juxtapositions, you have this rest, and when these things happen in a performance, the player must learn how to listen to the decay of the sound very carefully. I cannot dismiss the perception of the decay of a certain chord and how this suggests the sound of the next note. So basically, the decay of sound in piano playing is an ability, a skill that listening to it, controlling it, you cannot control the decay, I didn't mean that, controlling what comes after a sound based on the perception or the careful listening of that decay is a very important feature in piano playing. I was demonstrating that singful prelude in which Rachmaninoff, asks the performer to give accents on these two Gs. I have really hard time giving proper accents because it's the end of a motive. Why? See how important the decay of the G is. If I hadn't given more sound to the G, I wouldn't have had that beautiful effect of decay that suggests the A that follows. See, I'm over-exaggerating on purpose. Imagine playing it as it should, in quotes, be played. It would have to be followed by a rest. If I simply close the phrase being Rachmaninoff a supreme pianist composer, asks on the long note for an accent. And I do have to listen carefully to that G to play the following A with the right dynamic shading.
That's one of the critical concepts in piano playing. That's one of the essential ways of making a piano sound like more than a piano. But we pretend, we create these sonic images. Because what people don't, it was something I like to say all the time, is that a piano is an unmusical instrument. Because
physically,
it's a percussion instrument.
Physically,
all you can do, you press a key.
But you're also an animal.
Oh,
but
okay. In that
you're a human
with a
you're
soul.
An artist, you're a pianist.
Well, a great piano has a soul as well. But one of the ways in which we
I meant Albert before we are misunderstood. I am also an animal.
Yes, exactly.
But with a soul. I'm a pianist. I'm an artist.
Yes, I think there are two ways in which we can overcome the piano's inherent limitations. One of them is through dynamics, as you just described, and namely listening to the decay of each note, and then, for example, in a two-note slur, it's a little simple exercise that
yes.
And then if you hold it for an extremely long time, then the next note has to be very soft.
The next, you try to catch what remains of the sound of the G with the F.
Exactly.
But let's not forget the harmonies, the color that we give to harmonies.
Exactly. But I think the second way to overcome the piano's inherent limitations for me is in touch and in over legato. Sometimes one of the things that I see, one of the mistakes that I see very, very many piano students make is they tend to think a legato means as soon as you play the next note, at that moment you let go of the previous one. Maybe you could demonstrate, rather than overlapping the notes.
In other words, you're saying that they release the note too quickly.
Exactly.
I am over-exaggerating the articulation for viewers to get the grip. Yes, releasing the previous note gives the legato effect.
But you release it after you've already played, and you can
in a million different ways.
Yes. And you could. One of the things that I sometimes do, like one of the tricks of the trade, is sometimes I'll have three notes at once that are held down, right? Once in a while I'll do that. So there are many different degrees, right? In a single legato line. It's a special effect.
You're talking about finger pedaling, that's so-called finger pedaling? Of accompaniment?
No, even in a single melody, in a cantabile line.
Holding three notes?
Once in a while. Like I'll go as much as that, and I can't think of any examples offhand.
It's very brave, I must say.
Sometimes it works. If you don't use the pedal in that section, it's a sonic illusion, really.
Yeah, that's what I call finger pedaling. In fact, it's as if you want to get the illusion of pedaling without actually using the pedaling. Let's speak about the advantages.
Well, one is the biggest one is polyphony.
And multi-strata sonic illusion or sonic perspective. That's very important, and it's not as varied as an orchestra, but we have the advantage of being one mind.
Well, the piano
playing,
also
not different minds controlled by a conductor. So we can be administrators of this intricacy of voices, of sounds, this vertical disposition of sounds. We are the masters of it, which is a great advantage. It gives really harmony, that one color that you wish it to be.
And speaking of the orchestra, we shouldn't forget that the piano actually has a wider frequency spectrum than entire orchestra. So the
Especially this
especially the
instrument.
Bosendorfer Imperial.
Yes. Do you get this in orchestra? Well,
We can't. What's interesting is humans.
we don't want this to be a debate between piano and
No,
orchestra,
of course not,
because
but-
we would lose.
No doubt about that, because we don't have vibrato. We can't do a crescendo on a single note, etc. So there's a lot that the piano can't do. But there are some wonderful advantages.
Although one thing we could do, we can conduct. We should conduct. I should conduct here. To have this line, not simply push the keys. Accent. I love to, I have been trained that way. I love to overemphasize motions when I practice slowly. I have to watch the motions to take place. I have to watch myself conducting the piano. I have to. Yes, we can do. We can conduct the instrument if we have a technique that serves this purpose.
Absolutely. And there's another application of conducting, not just to piano playing, but to all instruments, and that is in the understanding of rhythm. I like to do conducting exercises with students to show that at a single tempo you might conduct 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or at that exact same tempo 1, 2, 3, 1, where and anything in between, where the beat, the ictus, as we say, it might be blurry. It might be something. It's not necessarily that single metronomic point, mechanical point in time. It might be rounded, or it might be extremely focused and sharp. And it's one of the ways in which our imagination can be brought to bear upon our piano playing.
I'd like to count out loud. Although that's not the same as conducting. And I recommend it as a practice method.
Well, I think all musicians need to count out loud. And
pianists, not wing
well,
players.
okay, not singers, I guess they
Say
can't.
pianists, especially also for hand coordination.
No doubt, and that's one of the difficult things to get students to do, because there are so many different rhythmic skills. But you mentioned rhythm as a particular weakness that it's a core skill that all musicians.
It's very crucial to develop.
Absolutely,
Immediately.
And there are several approaches. Right, one is I don't think personally that we should automatically apply the metronome to every piece we play, but we need to be able to play along with it. We need to allow it to
administrators of rhythm.
to understand where we are objectively, even though clock time is not musical time. So that's one rhythmic skill that all musicians need to develop. And another is simply counting out loud. And another...
It's not easy to do, though.
Not at all.
To count out loud is very difficult. You can count out loud. You can count the mean beat, the meter. 1, 2, 3, 1. Or the subdivision. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's very difficult. The slower the tempo, the more you have to subdivide the count. You know, when you count, you have to really subdivide. It's like surgery. Many students get bored with it, get dissatisfied, frustrated, because they find it very difficult to do. They have to insist. It will pay off. It will pay off after some time. Even in in technical command of the piece, not just rhythmic command. It's hard to believe to begin with, but it is true.
It's absolutely true, because some of the problems that we think are purely technical, and by which most people usually mean mechanical, are often really rhythmic problems in disguise.
I agree totally, yes, but it's hard to convince students of this. It's really hard because rhythm is invisible. You don't see rhythmic flows. You hear them, whereas you see technical flows more easily. Rhythm coordination affects also the way you command the keyboard. Technical evenness is mainly rhythmic evenness, and it has to be really checked every moment of your piano practice, how you rhythmically control, command everything that you're doing. And by rhythmically, I don't mean mathematically chunking or dividing, counting mathematically music, putting the metronome on and sticking to the metronome. I don't mean that. I mean really knowing where that note should, where should occur that sound, in the grid, in your mental grid of the music. It's very important to place the sonic elements where you wish, not just where they happen to be sometimes. It creates also mental chaos to live with music like that.
Can you show the students some of the ways in which you practice this music, like with the care and the precision in shaping phrases, shaping individual motives?
These are three notes of different duration, and you can hear it and you can see it from the way I approach the keyboard. Followed by chords, again a longer chord, that there is a different gesture, choreography of that. I practice hands separately. I individualize each note of each chord. I don't like to lump up chords and practice them as chords. I really like to use a more surgical approach to each note of the chord.
Because
So
that's voice leading. It's like
voice.
as if it were an
not
orchestral
only
piece.
voice leading, it's voicing also.
Yes.
It's the way I give to that specific chord its sound quality. So, and the voice leading, of course, that is for polyphony, but for instance, in this passage, this is typically full of voice leading. This is something between accompaniment and motive. This is a motive, of course. And there is the bass line. It's very important to memorize each voice separately, individually.
Like a separate instrument in the orchestra.
Yes, also a pianist should be able to play. Well, I can do an experiment. Invert the hands. This is very difficult to do for a piano student who's not used to it, who doesn't believe in it. You have to grow, you have to mature, you have to have bad experiences to realize how successful certain piano practice would have been if you had followed good advice. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that you should train your mind before you train your fingers. So my approach to piano practice is that of focusing my attention on minimal elements and spread the attention to an overarching larger element, no bigger than a phrase at a time, from the motive to the phrase, period, sentence of music. That is the maximum chunk for me that deserves attention in piano practice. It's not enough to have a complete picture of the section or of the piece, obviously. And I'm not talking about interpretation, I'm talking about learning. One should not practice too much, should not gain too much information in a given span of time. I would say one should really concentrate on a small, should we use the word chunk of music, small section, small fragment of music at a time, and then move on. So that's very much my practice strategy. I try to learn also in a way that I don't have to go back to the score and check what I should have done. For instance, in this prelude, Rachmaninoff gives very fastidious, detailed instruction on how to phrase, of the agogics, the rubato. In a diminuendo, I go back to the tempo. This is very idiosyncratic of his style of play. I should learn this immediately. I should learn it technically, mentally, emotionally, immediately, from the first stage. Otherwise, my musical conception of the piece, first, will not be mature enough. Will be too nouveau, too fresh. Second, it will not combine with all the technical gestures, with all the movements. Emotionally, it will be very immature. Third, perhaps most important, when we learn music, we don't learn music simply to play it. We learn music to be better musicians, better people, to enjoy music better. In other words, there is a side effect. Or should we say that should be the most desirable effect of music learning? Music learning should shape your day, shape your well-being. And if music practice, piano practice, is not attentive and it's not right brain, left brain, emotion, intellect, if these things are not combined, it becomes an effort. And it should always be done, I hope this is the right expression to end this conversation, should always be done with passion.
Thank you very, very much. I think this has been...
As always, it's fun and a pleasure talking to you.